Understanding the blood sugar connection between inflammation and diabetes is the first step towards controlling glucose more strategically and intelligently. Because when you understand how inflammation impacts your metabolism, you stop looking only at the sugar on your plate and start acting on the root of the problem. Today, I'm going to show you, in a simple and practical way, how inflammation and diabetes are connected in your...
Have you ever wondered why your blood sugar rises even when you feel you're doing everything right with your diet? Have you ever avoided sugar, controlled carbohydrates, followed your diet perfectly, and still seen high numbers on your blood sugar meter? Have you experienced this? If so, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you and could change how you understand managing your diabetes. When we talk about diabetes, the focus is almost always on sugar, on what you can and can't eat, on the amount of carbohydrates on your plate. But there's a silent, little discussed factor that may be behind these unexpected spikes. The connection between inflammation and diabetes. Yes, inflammation can directly influence your glucose levels, and many people simply ignore it. Chronic inflammation and diabetes are deeply linked. Unlike acute inflammation, such as a cut or infection, chronic inflammation is silent, internal, and constant. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't appear obviously, but it alters the functioning of your metabolism. And that's exactly where the problem begins. Understanding how inflammation raises blood sugar is essential for anyone who truly wants to improve their blood sugar control. Chronic inflammation interferes with how insulin works in your body. It impairs communication between insulin and cells, promoting insulin resistance and hindering glucose from entering cells. The result: more sugar circulating in the blood. This is why the inflammation connection can explain those seemingly senseless spikes. And when we talk about type 2 diabetes, inflammation, we're talking about a dangerous cycle. Inflammation increases insulin resistance, glucose rises. Excess glucose also fuels inflammatory processes, and the cycle continues. Often, people believe the problem is only with food, when in fact there's an internal process happening simultaneously. The most interesting thing is that this inflammation can be fueled by daily habits. Constant stress, poor sleep, excess ultra-processed foods, sedentary lifestyle, and abdominal fat accumulation. It's not just about sugar. It's about the metabolic environment you create within your body every day. What if I told you that maybe you're only focusing on cutting carbs, while the root of the problem might be reducing inflammation? What you're about to discover could open your eyes to a new level of awareness about your metabolic health. Because managing diabetes isn't just about counting grams of carbohydrates. It's about understanding what's happening behind the scenes. Inflammation and diabetes are not separate subjects. They go hand in hand. And the sooner you understand this connection, the more strategic and intelligent your approach to glucose control becomes. This is not about fear, but about knowledge, about taking control through information. Now, to truly understand how this process happens inside your body, and why it may be sabotaging your efforts, we need to dive a little deeper into the mechanism that links inflammation, insulin resistance, and rising blood sugar. Now that you understand, there is a direct connection between inflammation and glucose. Let's go deeper into the central point. How exactly does inflammation increase insulin resistance? To begin, it's important to understand what happens in the body when we talk about insulin resistance and inflammation. Insulin is the hormone responsible for opening the door of the cells so glucose can enter and be used as energy. When everything is working properly, this process is efficient and keeps blood sugar control balanced. But when chronic inflammation is present, this communication starts to fail. What we call insulin resistance happens because inflammatory substances released by the body, such as inflammatory cytokines, interfere with insulin receptors. It's as if the cell's lock becomes rusty. Insulin still tries to work, but the response is no longer the same. The result is a reduction in insulin sensitivity, meaning the cells become less responsive to insulin's action. And that is exactly why many people ask why inflammation increases blood sugar. The answer lies in this metabolic blockage. If glucose cannot properly enter the cells, it remains circulating in the bloodstream. This leads to higher blood sugar levels, even though insulin production is still happening. Now let's bring this into real life. Think about a night of poor sleep. Sleep deprivation increases inflammatory markers in the body and raises cortisol, the stress hormone. This environment promotes both inflammation and insulin resistance. The result: greater difficulty keeping glucose stable the next day. The same happens with chronic stress. Constant tension keeps the body in a state of alert, stimulating inflammatory processes. Over time, this contributes to high blood sugar causes that often go unnoticed. The person believes the problem is only in their diet, but stress is silently sabotaging metabolism. And speaking of diet, a pattern rich in ultra-processed foods, refined sugars, and inflammatory fats also drives this process. This type of diet promotes weight gain, especially abdominal fat, which is metabolically active and releases pro-inflammatory substances. This further intensifies insulin resistance and worsens blood sugar control. Do you see how everything is connected? Poor sleep, high stress, inflammatory eating habits, and a sedentary lifestyle create fertile ground for insulin resistance. And when insulin sensitivity decreases, the body needs to produce more and more insulin to try to compensate. Over time, this system becomes worn out and blood sugar begins to rise more frequently. Understanding this dynamic completely changes how you view diabetes control. It's not just about reducing sugar, but about reducing inflammation. It's not only about what you eat in a single meal, but about the lifestyle pattern you maintain every day. And that is exactly why, in the next step, we need to talk about the habits that are feeding this inflammation without you realizing it, and how small strategic changes can begin to reverse this process. Now that you understand how inflammation increases insulin resistance and disrupts blood sugar control, it's time to look at what actually fuels this inflammation in everyday life. Very often we don't realize that seemingly simple habits are contributing to metabolic inflammation and making blood sugar control much harder. One of the biggest invisible villains is inflammatory foods and their effect on blood sugar. It's not just the sugar you see in coffee or desserts, but the hidden sugar found in packaged breads, ready-made sauces, drinks, and ultra-processed foods. These products also contain refined oils, additives, and preservatives that trigger silent inflammatory responses in the body. Each meal like this creates small waves of inflammation that, over time, reduce insulin sensitivity and lead to those blood sugar spikes that seem to come out of nowhere. Beyond food, other daily habits directly affect inflammation and As a result, blood sugar levels. Physical inactivity, for example, lowers the body's ability to regulate glucose efficiently. When muscles don't move often enough, less circulating glucose is used, which contributes to high blood sugar driven by inflammatory processes. Chronic stress is another quiet but extremely powerful factor. Constant tension raises cortisol, the hormone responsible for the stress response, but it also interferes with how glucose is processed. High cortisol combined with elevated stress and blood sugar levels creates the perfect environment for chronic inflammation. This explains why, even with an apparently balanced diet, some people still struggle to maintain stable blood sugar. We also can't forget about sleep. Poor sleep or consistently short nights increase inflammatory markers in the body and raise cortisol, further intensifying metabolic inflammation. The body stays in a state of alert, reacting as if it were under constant threat, which weakens insulin action and increases the likelihood of blood sugar spikes. Another important factor is the accumulation of abdominal fat, which is closely linked to obesity and inflammation. This fat is not just cosmetic, it is active and releases inflammatory substances that interfere with insulin and glucose regulation. In other words, inflammation doesn't come only from food or stress, but also from the body itself, when lifestyle habits create the conditions for silent inflammatory processes. What all of this shows is that controlling blood sugar goes far beyond cutting sugar or counting carbohydrates. It requires looking at the whole picture: diet, sleep, stress levels, physical activity, and body composition. Every daily choice influences inflammation, and every rise in inflammation directly impacts blood sugar control, making diabetes management more complex than many people realize. The good news is that once we understand which habits are feeding inflammation, without us noticing, we can start acting strategically. Small, consistent changes, such as replacing inflammatory foods, adding daily movement, managing stress, and prioritizing quality sleep, have a direct effect on reducing inflammation and improving metabolic health. In the next few minutes, we're going to move to the next step: how to build a routine and an anti-inflammatory eating pattern that truly helps reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, and stabilize blood sugar levels in a sustainable way, without complications and with results you can feel in your daily life. Now that you understand how inflammation increases insulin resistance and glucose control, it's time to look at what really fuels this inflammation in everyday life. Often we don't even realize that seemingly simple habits are contributing to metabolic inflammation and making blood sugar control much more difficult. One of the biggest invisible villains is inflammatory foods and blood sugar. It's not just the sugar you see in coffee or desserts, but the hidden sugar present in processed breads, ready-made sauces, drinks, and ultra-processed foods. These products also contain refined oils, additives, and preservatives that trigger silent inflammatory responses in the body. Each meal of this type increases small inflammations that, over time, hinder insulin sensitivity and generate those seemingly inexplicable glucose spikes. In addition to diet, other daily habits have a direct effect on inflammation and, consequently, on blood sugar levels. Sedentary lifestyles, for example, reduce the body's ability to regulate glucose efficiently. When muscles don't move frequently enough, there's less use of circulating glucose, which contributes to high blood sugar levels related to inflammation. Chronic stress is another silent but extremely powerful factor. Situations of constant tension increase cortisol, a hormone that regulates the stress response, but also interferes with how glucose is processed. High cortisol levels and elevated stress and blood sugar levels create a perfect environment for chronic inflammation. This explains why, even following a seemingly balanced diet, some people still struggle to maintain blood sugar control. We can't forget about sleep. Poor sleep or insufficient sleep increases inflammatory markers in the body and raises cortisol, further intensifying metabolic inflammation. The body goes into a state of alert, reacts as if under constant threat, and impairs insulin action, increasing the likelihood of blood sugar spikes. Another important point is the accumulation of abdominal fat, which is closely linked to obesity and inflammation. This fat is not just aesthetic, it is active and releases inflammatory substances that interfere with insulin and glucose regulation. In other words, inflammation doesn't just come from food or stress, but also from the body itself, when habits and lifestyle create an environment conducive to silent inflammatory processes. What all this shows is that controlling glucose goes far beyond reducing sugar or counting carbohydrates. It's necessary to look at the whole picture: diet, sleep, stress levels, physical activity, and body composition. Every daily choice influences inflammation, and every increase in inflammation directly impacts blood sugar control, making diabetes management more complex than many imagine. And the good news is that when we understand which habits are fueling this inflammation without us realizing it, we can begin to act strategically. Small, consistent changes, such as replacing inflammatory foods, including daily movement, managing stress, and prioritizing quality sleep, have a direct effect on reducing inflammation and improving metabolic health. In the next few minutes, we'll move on to the next step: how to build an anti-inflammatory routine and dietary pattern that truly helps reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, and stabilize glucose levels sustainably, without complications, and with results you can see every day. Now that we understand how daily habits and inflammatory foods and blood sugar increase inflammation and impair glucose control, it's time to talk about practical solutions: how to reduce inflammation and improve glucose strategically. One of the most powerful tools in this process is the diet for diabetes. Unlike fad diets or extreme restrictions, this type of diet acts directly on the root of the problem: the silent inflammation that interferes with insulin action. By adopting a diabetes diet focused on foods that reduce inflammation, you can balance your body from the inside out. Foods that reduce inflammation, such as colorful vegetables, antioxidant fruit, healthy fats like olive oil and nuts, and lean proteins, help reduce inflammatory processes, improving insulin sensitivity and facilitating blood sugar control. Small, consistent changes already have a noticeable effect on glucose levels, without needing extreme or complicated solutions. But it's not just about what to put on your plate, but about creating a strategic eating pattern. An anti-inflammatory diet for diabetes doesn't mean cutting out all carbohydrates or eliminating flavor. This means choosing foods that help reduce inflammation and contribute to natural ways to lower blood sugar. This includes prioritizing fiber, spices like turmeric and ginger, and limiting ultra-processed products that intensify chronic inflammation. The main goal is to reduce inflammation, to lower blood sugar, and this can transform how you manage diabetes on a daily basis. By reducing inflammation, you strengthen your metabolism, improve your insulin response, and prevent those unexpected spikes that so often discourage those trying to keep their glucose levels stable. Furthermore, when we combine this diet with healthy habits such as adequate sleep, regular physical activity, and stress management, the results are enhanced. An integrated approach that prioritizes an anti-diet for diabetes allows you not only to reduce inflammation but also to create a sustainable health pattern that naturally improves glucose and strengthens metabolic health in the long term. And best of all, these changes are accessible and applicable to everyday life without complications, making glucose control more predictable and less frustrating. Stay with me, because in the next step we're going to understand how these concepts apply, especially to those who are pre-diabetic or dealing with type 2 diabetes, and how small choices can significantly impact natural ways to lower blood sugar.
We've reached the point where everything we've discussed so far begins to translate into practical action. Now that you understand the relationship between inflammation and glucose, how insulin resistance develops, and which habits silently fuel inflammation, it's time to talk about how to break the inflammation cycle and stabilize glucose strategically and sustainably. The first step is simple. It's not about radical changes or extreme restrictions, but about consistent daily adjustments, choosing foods that reduce inflammation, prioritizing quality sleep, practicing regular physical activity, and managing stress. Each of these actions directly reduces chronic inflammation, improves insulin sensitivity, and strengthens blood sugar control. Another essential point is taking care of gut health and blood sugar. Gut health directly influences inflammation and glucose metabolism. Natural probiotics, fiber, and fermented foods help balance the microbiota, reducing inflammatory markers and contributing to a better insulin response. A healthy gut translates into more stable glucose levels and a lower risk of unexpected spikes. Daily movement is equally important. Simple physical activities, such as walking, resistance training, or stretching, not only burn glucose but also help reduce inflammation and improve cell sensitivity to insulin. Small doses of daily consistency can yield greater results than sporadic intense workouts. These simple adjustments fit into a smart and sustainable diabetes management model by combining an anti-inflammatory lifestyle, habits that strengthen metabolism, attention to gut health, and stress management. You create a solid foundation for maintaining stable glucose and reducing the impact of inflammation naturally. For those seeking integrated solutions, it's also interesting to consider the perspective of functional medicine diabetes, which looks at the body as a whole, identifying root causes and applying personalized prevention and control strategies. This approach reinforces that controlling diabetes is not just reacting to glucose spikes, but acting proactively to balance metabolism and reduce chronic inflammation. When you adopt these practices, you notice a real change in your body. Less glucose variation, more energy, less inflammation, and a greater sense of well-being. The cycle that once seemed uncontrollable begins to be broken with simple, intelligent, and consistent actions that can become a part of your lifestyle forever. And if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for following all the content. If this topic resonated with you, leave a comment with a phrase like "I'm with you" until the end, or "this message was from me." I love knowing that we're together on this journey to better understand how inflammation impacts glucose.
If you realized that this information can really help you in your daily life, go ahead and like the video. It's a way to show that the content truly connects with you, and it helps me bring you more practical tips on diabetes management, healthy habits, and glucose control. And to continue learning, there's a video here that complements this topic, with even more practical strategies to reduce inflammation and improve insulin sensitivity. Click and stay with me there, because the next step will give you tools that you can apply to your daily life in a simple and sustainable way.